That is so bad. Oh well. Okay. Modal dialogues block. Oh, it's time. Wow, what a crowd. So it looks like we've got most of our attendees remote for this one. That's good. We can still make some progress. Just a brief couple of slides here to get things going. Note well, you've all seen it at least once, I hope. And we have a very well-structured agenda this time. It'll take me a minute to get the screen sharing set up for this one, but essentially this is what I've discussed with the editors, that this is I think the best way to approach the current set of work that we have on hand, and we will simply just go through the open issues. And for that, I will leave most of the work in the hands of Richard, who has helpfully volunteered to sort of walk us through some of these things and do that. Does anyone want to add or amend the agenda in any way? I do need a note taker, but I think I might be able to do that. Let me see. Is anyone remotely willing to take some notes for us to lighten the load? Not many people in here. That's not Murray. Let's not ask Murray. I think he's got enough work on his plate already. All right, I'll take a few notes. I think we'll make notes in the GitHub issues when we work things out as we go anyway. So I will just bring up that.
Actually, one more hot top level note, Martin. Do you want to say anything about kind of objectives here?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we have not made a lot of progress on the draft we did not make progress on the draft for a very long time, but in the past, I see probably 3 or 4 weeks, there's been quite a bit of activity on GitHub, and it looks like the current revision of the draft is pretty close, but there are a number of issues that we need to sort of resolve. My understanding is that most of these issues are relatively trivial, and they just require either a little bit of confirmation from the folks here or a short amount of discussion. And we hope that we can discharge quite a number of these in this session. And then we can talk about working group last call for the draft, or if the discussions drag on a little bit, we may need to have another sequence of meetings, maybe some interims, if that makes sense to people. And then it seems like, based on the state of the document and the discussion we've had, that it's pretty close to done, and we just need to give it a little bit of a push over the edge to get something that's ready to publish. So the idea is, if we can, we'll finish working through these issues. There's quite a few of them here, but if we can't, we'll try to get to working group last call as quickly as we possibly can. Now, how do I get this into a new window? There we go. Let me find this, share screen. All right, so I have to stop this now. Yeah. God damn. This one. Wow. There we go.
There we go.
I will zoom that a little and
All right, so I looked through these a bit in advance of the meeting. I think, Martin, the way to go about this may be to go from kind of most recent to least, because there's a lot of older things at the bottom that I think we can mostly agree are obsolete. Should we fire up number 100 there, please?
right.
Right, so this is one of a series of issues that UN filed based on some email feedback on the list. There's the word stream appears several points in the document, and the question is whether we need to have a definition for that in this document. As I commented in my prep here just after the morning session, I think my opinion here is that we probably don't need a notion of stream in this document. If you look at how SFRAME works, it's pretty much a per payload process. You identify the key ID and sequence and counter you're going to use. You encrypt using that, or decrypt, and off you go. The one exception is replay, which there's another issue on. There you need some description of what scope you're doing replay protection within, right? Because you need something within which you're looking for replay. But I think that's mainly the right aggregation point there is a key or key ID. And so we can just talk about that, the collection of packets encrypted for a single key or key ID, and don't need any other notion of stream. So basically the proposed resolution here would be to go through the document. We can obviously allude to things like external notions of streams, like whatever RTP defines, but otherwise have SFRAME operate on single packets, modular the whatever we do for replay.
Any feedback on that proposal? Jonathan, you have the floor.
Does that imply requirements on what the thing defining how to put SFRAME into some container provides to SFRAME? And is that well described in this document?
I think the answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is probably no.
Well, then there's
so yeah, that's a good point. I think that right. So let me try to read that back to you. So
yeah,
I think there's a requirement here that applications specify which, in which context they expect which key IDs to be used. Right. So key IDs, cipher suites, things like I guess they could just go together. Right. So there needs to be mapping like that somewhere, mainly in the sending direction. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the receiver has to know, I guess, which keys to expect where, and
yeah,
I mean, unless if that's explicit, that's okay. But then, also especially if there's like requirements like who should or shouldn't use the same keys and things like that, that might need to be specified.
Yeah.
And in particular, obviously, I'm thinking about this in the context of, if there's a RTP payload for carrying SFRAME, what does that need to specify, and what should the split be between what's in the RTP payload and what's in the SFRAME document proper, and where's the best place for all that stuff to live?
Right. Yeah, I expect there may be yet a third document here involved in works, but somehow it should be some sort of signaling for how the RTP
Mm.
payload is set up.
Mm.
But yeah, I think, yeah, that's something we need to capture. I think that we've got the right requirements and the need accurately described here. I think the editors can go off and take a stab at defining that.
Mm. Okay, thanks.
But yeah, we need that, but I don't think we need, I don't think that implies that we need a new definition of some sort of stream construct within
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's true. Yeah. But I would think I've sort of got to more generally like where, what does S-frame need from RTP or,
Right.
MPEG transport streams or whatever, and where is that specified, and should there be a generic thing that says if you're defining a container for S-frames, these are the things you need to make sure you specify. And
Yep.
I feel like that last point should probably be in this document, or at least a document from this working group.
Mm-hmm. Bernard?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the AVT core working group has completed a work on end-to-end security in SCIP, and the architecture bears some similarities to S-frame, but there are some key elements that are missing in S-frame. That is, in SCIP not only provides an end-to-end encrypted payload, but it also provides transport for the key management protocol. So that there's essentially one stream that does both the negotiation. In fact, SCIP also does codec negotiation, but it looks a lot like the architecture of S-frame, but it also transports key management. And that has some, there are a few differences, but I just wanted to point out that there's also this key management transport aspect that SCIP has that is not described in the S-frame document. And it also, SCIP describes how the SDP is done, which essentially is handled as a codec, so that the SDP doesn't tell you what's inside. That's done entirely within the end-to-end management framework. So anyway, just wanted to point that out.
And Bernard, just so I understand what you're saying here, you're just providing this as an example prior art that we could draw analogies from, not something that we would want to reuse.
Right.
Here, correct? Okay, thanks.
Right. But it deals with a lot of the questions that you had, like, the ISG had a lot of questions, and we had to go through where the packetizer goes and all the stuff that you've been talking about. It's already been worked through in another document. So you have an example of how all this gets worked through and what the SDP looks like, and essentially could be reused.
And do Martin's notes have the acronym right there, SCIP?
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's the NATO end-to-end security framework.
Jonathan, you're back in queue.
Yeah, no, I'm back. I'm just sort of to follow up to Bernard. Yeah, I think architecturally, I don't think SCIP is the has made a lot of architectural decisions because it is something that was originally a point-to-point thing, and over telco lines, and has then been modified to RTP. So I think a lot of those questions, a lot of the right answers to this context probably involve the word MLS, for the keying and whatnot. But we do have to specify, that does need to be specified somewhere, and which group that is that specifies it, I'm not sure, but it needs to be somewhere.
Okay, great. So just to
I'm not sure. We've wandered a long way off this actual issue, so probably we should open new issues.
Well, yeah, I think
we're.
Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we've probably started to drift off into other issues. How about we sort of record the issue? Richard, do you think you have enough information here to proceed? I also see Sergio, I think, is in the room as well. Editors on the draft, are you happy?
Yeah, I think we've got a clear direction on this issue. I think we probably need to file another issue to track what does the application need to do issue that Jonathan pointed out. which will just be the action there is just check what's in the document currently, and I expect we'll probably need to add a section to condense what's there and make it real clear.
Does that work for you?
Yep, that works for me.
Yeah, it works for
Okay.
me too. For what I see.
So issue 99.
Let's do it. So the issue is here. So section 5.1 is the more manual key agreement. And Sergio might have more intuition here than I do. But the idea is that you assign key IDs to participants. Right now, there's a mention of an ability to hash a key forward. There's an HKDF derivation in there. And there's a mention of sending a new key out when the participant list changes when there's join or leave. I think this issue is corrected in ambiguity right now. I sketched out a way that you could have a less ambiguous key ID if you scroll down a little bit. I think, in my opinion, that's probably the right answer to specify something concrete like that, where you specify, how many times you've sent fresh keys and how many times you've ratcheted. I don't know, Sergio, do you have thoughts on kind of that approach and construction? Other folks obviously feel free to chime in as well. I guess it's the higher level context as well that we have these sections 5.1 and 5.2, which describe how you do keying with kind of manual assignment of keys to senders, or out of band things assignment of keys to senders. So as I think this pretty much maps to what folks do for group messaging and Signal today. So there's Signal-like key management protocol, and 5.2 is an MLS-based key management protocol. So this is sort of this issue is sort of clean up on the more Signal-like one.
No feedback?
Okay. I think we can sort this out among the others. There's not really any substantive issue here, or kind of philosophical issue here. It's just kind of how you clear up the ambiguity.
Okay. Sounds right. Issue number 97, out of scope key management. This is interesting. Does this relate to the discussion we're having about what is it an application needs to do, and avoiding normative language, but sort of setting out the bounds of the? It strikes me this is a place where 2119 language may not be appropriate, and it's more guidance.
Well, I appreciate that instinct, but I think I think we'll have hard requirements for what an application needs to do and recommendations for what the application should do. Right. So if you don't do the key rotation as the must specifies here, then you don't get certain security properties, which are good security properties. So if you want those security properties, you have to do this. And I think we could say that we as this group think those are good security properties to have. So I expect we'll follow that as a should here. That's my proposal as well. But yeah, certainly it doesn't make sense to be a must.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are arguments about whether, specifications that, put requirements on what other specifications have to do should use 2119 language or not. I'm sort of agnostic on that, but you can decide that, I think, as the editor. But it should be clear that these are requirements on another specification, not on implementations.
Harald?
Harald Alvestrom. It's clear to me that this is a place where we want to document the security property that using this thing can have. That is, if you want the security property of forward secrecy, then you need to do this. So it's advised to someone's using it. It's not a 2119 type requirement.
Yep, we can phrase it that way.
Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward to me.
Actually,
Direction has been given.
apropos of UN's comment above with lowercase must, does anyone happen to know what the current like IESG info guidance is on lowercase? 2119 words, but not all uppercase, because I thought the guidance was not to do that. If you're going to use an RFC,
Some people yeah, 8174 says that if it's in lowercase, it has no special meaning. So if you were to choose to use lowercase musts, although some people still subscribe to the school that says that if you put lowercase musts in, people get confused about whether or not you intended to capitalize or not. I think it would be very clear in this context that that's not what's happening. So I think it's just a matter of you choosing appropriate language.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm going to follow on to RFC 6919 for alternative ways to word around RFC 2119.
But make sure you use the 8119 boilerplate if you're doing that. That's the other thing, which you probably should in general.
You mean
That just
8174?
comes for free now.
Whatever it is, yeah.
Yeah.
I forgot. I thought this was one of the ones where they were clever about the number, but I guess I was wrong.
BCP 14.
All right, issue number 96. So there's mention of RTP things throughout the document. That, for folks' context, this document started out as being fairly RTP specific, but it became clear as we discussed that both, there was some disagreement about how to integrate this with RTP, as well as some desire to apply it to non-RTP use cases. So my impression is there's pretty good agreement across the working group that this is a general format specification, not specific to RTP at this point. And so we just need to do an audit of the document and make sure that any mentions of RTP are in examples. They're not normative. Does anyone think that that's the wrong approach and we really need to make this RTP specific? Jonathan.
I agree with that, but I feel like I would be more confident about this document before it actually goes to publication if we had at least reasonably well mature thing using it for both RTP and probably also MPEG transport streams, so that we can be sure it works. And ideally, you could even translate between the two in a useful way without knowing the end-to-end keys.
Mm-hmm.
That the last part may ambiguous, but certainly at least have meaningful embeddings in more than one thing, so that we know we got how this says everything it needs to.
I agree. That's a noble aspiration. Bernard?
Yeah, one way to test that is that you can implement SFRAME, at least in theory, over the WebRTC data channel, right? And just send it to another data channel and decrypt it, and you shouldn't need to know anything about RTP to do that.
Yeah,
so that's kind of one way to test it out that it's RTP independent, is you just take it, shove it in a data channel, send it, and decrypt it. And you can display it even, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the state of the art in implementation sort of demonstrates that, and I think we've got sort of two flavors of implementation today. One is with Chrome's insertable streams, which again just kind of shove arbitrary data into RTP payloads, and the other implementation is the one I'm aware of in WebEx, where we don't do any signaling. We just transform the RTP payload before and after SRTP protection unprotect. And in both of those cases, we sort of treat the RTP channel as a generic packet transport and don't really interact with the RTP semantics. Well, I guess that's not totally true, because the insertable streams approach has its generic packetizer, so there's a little bit more interaction with RTP. But anyway, the per packet approach that is done in, for example, in WebEx, doesn't touch the RTP semantics at all. So maybe that's a good example of having one that it has some interaction with RTP and one that doesn't.
That makes sense, Bernard?
Yeah,
Okay. So I think this resolution seems about right. I'm not hearing any discussion about the resolution, just some more advice for editors, so that's good. You happy, Richard? Next one?
Yep, let's roll.
Making good progress. 89.
Oh, I just filed
That's
to
easy.
track that PR. This if you can pull up the PR for a second, that might actually be interesting for folks to discuss. So this PR redoes the overhead analysis that's in the document. Looking at, yeah, sorry, it's kind of replacing one scenario by the other. The overview here is probably a better way to look at this. And I apologize, I'm a little off the cuff here because I haven't looked at this PR in a minute, but basically the idea here is to compare a few scenarios for how you can deploy SFRAME, in units of single bytes or single bytes, single RTP media payloads, or on the unit of whole frames, and compare the overhead on this approaches in various scenarios. I think the current document had some assumptions about data rates and things like that. This new approach tries to capture some kind of scenarios that map a little bit more obviously to scenarios you see in the wild in terms of media streams, and capture what basically I think we end up with what the kind of kilobits per second overhead is of SFRAME in those various cases. So I don't think we need to go through this here. I just wanted to kind of flag that for folks. If you were looking for something to do in the back of other meetings at the IETF this week, I would love to have more commentary on this PR. But I don't think this needs a ton of discussion. But it would be good to know if this frames things in a useful way, or for kind of hitting the right kind of scenarios here.
So there's a bit of a preview of the sort of numbers that come out of that, depending on different sets of assumptions. Anywhere from 0.1% to, what's that, 27%? Wow.
Yeah, so it's 27% on an audio stream with tiny packets.
Yeah, lots of little audio packets that are very well compressed, and yeah. Yeah, it's not a lot of, in absolute numbers, it's probably very small, but it's still, yeah. Okay, thanks, Richard. I think that one's there for someone to look at. I know you've asked Justin to have a look at it. Maybe we need to poke him again. This one again looks like something that is something that you just need to get around to doing, rather than anything that we can talk about here.
Yeah.
It just means that the test vectors are that much more useful if we do that. That's good.
That's just tracking issue, yeah.
And 85, easy, obviously.
Yeah, I think 76 will be the next interesting one, I think.
Yeah.
So replay. It's the most complicated thing about SRTP, and it will probably be the most complicated thing here. So SRTP, I know several of us in the room here have dealt with a bit. SRTP has a pretty clear attempt to avoid replay, which is in a scenario like SFRAME, where we're trying to use AEAD and there are bad consequences to reuse of the key nodes pair. Replay is pretty bad, and so it's good to have some protections against it. But of course, having code to detect replay and even defining what replay protections you want involves some complexity. And as we discussed a couple issues ago, you have to define within what scope you're doing replay protection. So I think if you scroll down to the bottom of this discussion, I quoted the bits from SRTP with the idea of saying that's about the approach we should take here. So there's not a ton of complexity here. It just says that implementations need to maintain a replay window in which they track used packet numbers of some sort. I think in the RTP case, they use the extended sequence number plus the rollover counter. Here we would probably use the counter, which we may need to, whose semantics, as Sergio points out, we may need to tie down a little bit more. But yeah, I think the overall idea here would be basically to attach to each key ID a replay window that would be keyed on the counter that goes with it. Recalling we only have those two fields in the S-frame header, the key ID and the counter. So use the key ID to identify the replay context and the counter to identify what we're checking for. Magnus.
Yes, Magnus Westland. I think the interesting question about how much replay protection need is how well the underlying application is capable of dealing or suppressing duplicates. So if you want, it's one thing to say, okay, if you have a window base, this is outside the window, or do you actually need to suppress all duplicates? So that comes down to saying, will the application, I mean, most RTP application real-time media, if you have a timestamp sequence number for a stream, you put them in the buffer, etc., and you consume them, and then it's either passed or either just trying to replace the same data, etc. Those are dealt with. But if the application doesn't have any fields inside the S-frame for that information, then it would be vulnerable for this type of replays. So I think that's where some of the difficulty in this question is saying, how much do you need? So.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I suppose I should say, in the interest of complete, it's like we could decide not to address this issue. Like if we focus purely on cryptographic requirements, where avoiding, where the only real consideration is avoiding reuse of a key nonce pair, then like you can't prevent that with replay protection. You can only prevent it with key management. And so we may decide that leads us to not caring about replay detection on the receiver side, in which case, as Magnus points out, we could flag this as a potential issue to the application, revisiting that issue we just opened. We just have to note it. Martin, I think it looks like you're in the queue.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when you think about these things, you can potentially build in anti-replay at multiple layers of the stack, at which point you end up producing some interesting sort of timing oracles when something is a replay, because you get halfway through the stack and you've engaged half of the replay protections but not the other half, and you can sort of tell how far you've gotten through the process. So it's potentially even advantageous to do nothing about replay at this layer at all, simply because you want to avoid providing that oracle. And it's probably not as much of a problem here because the observability of the processing of these packets is not great, but it may be something that you want to consider if you can rely on the application itself providing robust protections against replay at, say, the SRTP layer.
Yeah, it's a great point, and yeah, so yeah, just to be clear, like if we expect this to be used in an end-to-end context, which I think we all sort of do, if you're using SRTP on the bottom, you already have replay protection down there. If you're setting it over TLS or DTLS, there's always some replay protections there. So yeah, that's not a totally implausible assumption that we could just express that as a requirement that we have some replay protection elsewhere, either above or below S-frame. Jonathan, see you next.
Yeah, but as you say, you want the replay, if you want end-to-end replay protection, SRTP isn't going to provide that because the SRTP is not end-to-end. So, if you're worried about the SFU, and malicious SFU doing the replay, then you need to provide some protection against that.
Right.
And I feel like that is where it might need to be in the SFRAME proper, because you might not even have the same application end to end. If you are talking about like you have an RTP to mock gateway where you've got SFRAMEs going end to end, which is not an entirely unreasonable scenario, I think. And then obviously you've got two different applications both sending SFRAMEs. The application, you can't say the application will provide it, because there is no the application.
Mm-hmm. Harald?
Harald Alderström. Remember that we're living in a packetized world where packets get duplicated. In particular, packets get read sent. So in my experience, replay protection is a matter of updating statistics. It's completely useless for anything security-wise.
Okay, Sergio?
I was going to say mostly the same that Jonathan said. I think that we have to, that the reply protection should be worried about an SVU capturing or recording the media of some participant and then replaying it back in again later on in the conference. So the SRT protection will not trigger, because the SVU will take care of this event of being properly RTP packetized, but the media itself will be duplicated. So I think that the protection needs to be inside SFRAME. And I think that what I meant to say in the issue is that maybe we don't need to put a replay window that it is in counting the number of packets, but probably just make sure that but a time-based replay window saying that if you receive something that in the last from an older CRT in the last 1 second or something like that, that we can reject it. So, but we have to put something about reply protection inside this frame.
So Sergio, are you saying you would prefer that sort of time-based provision to one based on the SFRAME counter?
Maybe it's easier to implement, so I'm okay about both, but maybe one is easier to implement than the other. I don't necessarily recall why I thought that implementing replay windows in CRT may be a bit more complex, but yes, I will be fine as well with a replay window with a number of packets.
Yeah, and maybe I guess another question one could ask is whether there's mandatory, because if we don't need a single mandatory approach, we could document both the time-based and counter-based approaches and let implementations choose which is easier.
Okay.
Roman. So I think any of the kinds of replays that can happen, maliciously versus accidentally, are going to be different for reliable versus unreliable transports. And so trying to do something generic, I think is going to, in this document, is going to be complicated. Whereas saying, we've got most of the use cases for this were envisioned are using SRTP, providing some general guidance, and then also saying like these other categories of things, could be an issue with a malicious SFU if you happen to be using some other reliable transport like web transport or web transport or something, So, but I think the solution, like if you want a harder solution, then you should do it on a per transport basis and not in this document.
Sergio, you have one more comment? Okay, so I think a lot of good points here. I'm just trying to sum up. So I think it's a good point that the transports will not provide end-to-end replay to protection against replay by the SFU. But as Rowan points out there, I guess that is not even transport a transport issue. So I think where I might kind of propose we land here is noting the security trade-off that replay protection against network attackers is provided by something else. We have seen this as in end-to-end context, but applications that receivers that have concerns about replay by intermediaries may apply a replay window either based on time or based on the counter. So fairly loose. That proposal will be fairly loose in terms of it would not specify a single mandatory mechanism for protecting replay, or indeed would not require any replay mechanism. Do folks feel comfortable with that level of looseness?
I think so, because there's I think there's kind of a general. Hang on. Sorry. There's kind of a general question of what do you actually trust? What exactly is your trust relationship with the SFU in this? And if you is something going on? Sorry. What is your trust relationship with the SFU? What do you trust it to do or not do? I mean, I think if you basically just don't want it to be able to listen to media, but you trust it to behave properly in all other respects, then you can just sort of not, like you said, not do anything. Whereas, if you're less trusting of it, and I think there's certain things like that would be very hard to not trust it to do, like lie about who's speaking and things like that, depending on keying and whatnot. But
So, Jonathan, are you suggesting that maybe Richard's suggestion is exactly what you want here?
yeah, I think so. So possibly we want to be more explicit about what exactly is the trust relationship with these intermediaries.
Yeah, I think we can do that.
I think this is. I think that fits firmly into the necessary text you put around the thing that Richard is talking about. So that's good. Thanks. All right. I think that's really good feedback on, I think, probably one of the bigger issues that we had on the list here. Are there any others that you would like to sort of jump on out of order, or we just continue through the process?
Sorry, I'm just scanning through here. Why don't we click on the number 70 there?
Yeah.
Sorry, I haven't looked at this one recently.
Let's just load them up.
Yeah, I think these are feedback on the adoption call. Bernard, you're on the line. You can feel free to speak up here, but I think these are largely fairly specific things. But yeah, we can break these out into individual issues to work through. So I think this is sort of an editor to do.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch here as well.
Yep.
Okay. Who should I assign this one to? This one looks like if we're going to be meeting again, this one needs to be done before then.
Yeah. Why don't we assign it to UN, because he filed it. We can bother him to file to. And he's not on the call, so the fundamental rule of meetings. You don't show up for the meeting, you get the action items.
Right. All right, that's good. Where are we?
That's
That one.
Oh yeah. So we have this metadata field as a way to shove anything into the authenticated data. Obviously, what you shove in there is going to depend on, what makes sense in the application context. Yeah. So this again, we're back to assumptions about the application. Right. So there's no specification in the packet as to what has gone into that AAD. So you could end up with some opaque and hard to diagnose failures if the sender and the receiver disagree what got put in the metadata. This may also be one where some cleanup is necessary because there are some more concrete suggestions about what you would put in the metadata in earlier drafts. But I think my read here, again, not having looked at this in great detail, is that mechanically we're probably okay with the mechanism that exists for shoving metadata in, but we probably need to be clear that the application needs to be specified and ensure that the sender and the receiver agree on what goes in that metadata field. I don't know, Sergio, did you have any other thoughts on this? I suppose UN also mentions that I think UN was pushing on this question of whether we need the metadata mechanism at all. It's a fair question. My impression is pretty cheap. You just tag stuff on the end of the AD field. But yeah, another option here would be to just to not do anything. Sergio, oh, sorry, Jonathan is in the queue.
Yeah.
Sergio wants to go first. Go ahead. Sorry.
It seems weird to talk about authentication metadata when we are not saying how it's going to be sent or how to receive it. So, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what is the use case of the end-to-end metadata here compared to the normal normal media. So, I'm not sure exactly what use case do we have for sending metadata in clear. So it has to be authenticated, and versus sending it encrypted inside the S-frame payload at all. So it seems to me that we should proceed. We should try to send everything end-to-end encrypted, and I don't see a reason why there could be any metadata that should be sent in clear.
Jonathan?
Yeah, this is, I think, an example of where I'd like to see the applications using this be at least sketched out. If we write an application or two and none of them have any use for it, maybe we should get rid of this. Especially what I'm worried is I think there are use cases for gateway between applications, and if applications specify different metadata, that would be extremely annoying. So I'd like to, I think this is a feature which we should figure out whether we really need it, and if not, maybe take it out just for the sake of simplifying usages.
Yeah, I think just to clarify, I think the kind of use cases folks had in mind for this were cases where you might be able to end-to-end encrypt pretty much everything, but maybe there's some frame marking or something that you want to be visible to the SFU for the purpose of making good choices on what's forward. But you want to make sure that the SFU can't tamper with it or forge it without causing the decryption to fail on an end-to-end basis. So that's the sort of application which gets you some better security properties than just sending the unencrypted metadata. But it's not implausible to me. Jonathan says that see what more precisely applications needs are. Rowan?
Yeah, Roman May. So I mean, for me, the classic use case for this would be that you send in metadata that somebody that you think that somebody started speaking and somebody stopped speaking in an audio stream. And if somebody proposes that we don't protect that with end-to-end integrity, then I'd be really curious what they think that we should do instead, because that seems like a pretty classic example.
Harald?
So my canonical example of metadata, Harald Avestrom. My canonical example of metadata is the frame descriptor, which is depends the descriptor that describes the layering in an SVC encoded video, where you expect the SFU to read the metadata, and you expect the SFU based on that to throw away some frames. And it might actually choose to discard or modify the dependency descriptor so that it fits in with the next hop. But there's value in putting a copy of whatever you want to sign inside the frame before you encrypt it. But that's part of the encryption process, not part of the transmission process. Metadata in this sense, what you put on the outside of the packet, is really instructions to the transmission system. And those need to be protected by other means than by putting them inside the packet. And what arrives at the endpoint may not be what's being sent. So put the damn thing inside and call it data.
Sorry, I didn't follow that, Harold. You said several things there.
Yes.
Can you try to restate what it was that you were saying?
So if you put stuff on the outside of the packet,
Yes.
It's going to be modified in transit, legitimately. If you put stuff on the inside of the packet and encrypt it, it's going to arrive at the destination unchanged. These two things don't have to match up. So we should, to simplify a model, just say that if you want stuff inside the frame,
Okay.
that arrives at the destination and is verifiable, just say it's data. The concept of metadata just confuses this particular specification.
If I could try to read that back, I think in order for metadata to be useful in the way we have it here, it would need to be visible to the transmission system, but not modified, guaranteed not to be modified by the transmission system. And I think if I hear Harold correctly saying there's not really anything that fits both of those criteria. Either it is information that doesn't need to be visible to the transmission system, or if it is visible, then it will be modified. And so this protection is integrity protection is applicable. But Rowan?
So yeah, so again, that's why I asked about voice activity detection, or speech energy levels. That speech energy levels used for detecting when someone is when a participant is likely speaking, like that is information that needs to be viewed and should not be modified. And it should be, if it is modified, you should be able to detect that it was modified. So I'm not arguing that the other things that Harold said are wrong. I'm just saying that for the case of voice activity detection, I'm asking how would you do that instead?
So just to confuse your mind, the RTP header extension for client to SFU carrying of that information is different from the RTP extension for carrying from the SFU to the client. So it's modified. Sorry about that.
Bernard.
I think
Yeah.
the term metadata is a little bit confusing because it covers a lot of things which need to be handled differently. So the point of things like dependency descriptor, the stuff that's in the dependency descriptor is inside the codec payload, right? The reason it's put in the dependency descriptor is to make it visible to the SFU. So you don't really also need to put it in the payload because it's already in there. You have the info on the layering and all of that junk. It's already inside the payload, so you don't need to duplicate it there. It's not used. Typically, these things are not used. There may be a few exceptions. They're not used by the decoder. Let me put it that way. They're not relevant to the decoder. They may be relevant to the SFU, and maybe in some circumstances to the RTP receiver, but that's about it.
I'm not really detecting an outcome here. I think, has anyone got an answer for Rowan?
So I just unmuted. Just the resolution I was going to propose here is that we keep the authenticated metadata feature we have for the moment. Point number one, keep the feature in there and explain, add it to the description of what the application has to do. The application needs to make sure that's coherent between the sender and the receiver. But at the end of the, after all that, mark this as a feature at risk, which needs more confirmation. This is something that applications actually need. And then we can kind of resolve this at working group last call time, whether we want to keep it. So like I said, it's kind of a cheap feature. It's one line of do we have the metadata there or not in the authenticated data. Does that sound acceptable, folks?
And this, the content of this, just to confirm, would be specified by the application and very much application specific.
Yeah. So what it says is like the authenticated data in your AEAD computation is some bits that SFRAME specifies, which are delimited, and whatever bits the application wants to add after that. And so if we remove the feature, we just say it's just the bits that SFRAME specifies. Jonathan?
Yeah, I agree with you. I just, on the case of it's cheap for SFRAME. I'm not sure it's cheap for applications because applications have to describe how to reassemble it bit exact, which is often, surprisingly hard. So
yep.
I can understand why applications might decide this is too hard, I don't want it, at which point, that would go towards your feature at risk.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that is cheap in units of spec text is the dimension I meant in which it is cheap. So it's easy to add or remove.
Yeah. Okay. So it's cheap, but if no one ends up using it, there's not a lot of point in having it. Okay. There we go.
And I think most of the things below that.
SFRAME transform.
Yeah, I might see if Harald has anything to say about this from the W3C end of things. Whether that insertable streams or SFRAME transform document has been progressing, whether there's anything that's special that's needed here. I honestly haven't looked at that much lately. Harald, any thoughts here?
Frankly, I've been leaving this one to UN.
Okay.
So I don't have anything to say about that.
Okay. All right, so I think this is for UN to follow up and see if we need anything done here.
Okay. No.
Yeah, this is a pretty old, this is a 3-year-old, almost 3-year-old issue. 3 years old as of IETF117. The note here is simply that we have a ad hoc variant structure in the document right now. Quick has a variant structure that is in quick stacks that could be borrowed. I don't know if folks are quick enthusiasts, then perhaps we could pull this in. If not, we can probably close this issue.
Yeah, it seems to me like the number is always bigger on the right, apart from like here where it should be 8.5 and here. And okay, so there's a couple of places it's a little bit bigger, but whatever. No opinions?
I think as the conclusion of the description there says, one nice feature is that you don't have to deal with the 4-bit segments. You always deal with whole bytes, but this is not
Right.
that much code one way or the other. I think we can just close this one.
All right. Yep.
Unless anyone has quick envy. I think I wrote this when we were reusing the quick variants in MLS, which was handy there because we needed a variant structure and didn't have one.
Right. Okay. Oh boy. Obsolete. Now, are these ones that are marked obsolete truly obsolete? Should we just be closing them or should we review them?
I marked those as obsolete in hopes of getting review from one of the other editors, but I think we can have the obsolete ones reviewed by handled by the editors to confirm that.
Okay.
I think most of these are the document has evolved out from under it and it's not relevant anymore.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's dive in this. Right. Let me just look to see if this text is still in document.
So is this the case where you have potentially a rekeying operation that is currently active and something indicates that you're using the next keys and you're waiting for the next keys? Do you buffer the packets in anticipation of the keys arriving because you're ready to go, but the keys haven't arrived yet?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, what the document says at the moment is if a ciphertext fails to decrypt because there's no key available, the client may buffer the ciphertext and retry decryption once a key shows up.
That sounds enough to me.
Well, I wonder if this is yet another one that makes sense to punt to the application, right? So if you imagine you had an SFRAME library that reported like, hey, I don't have a key for this. The application is managing the keys, and so it probably has the context as to whether a key is likely to show up for that. And so the application could manage that retry loop, and so we wouldn't have to specify it here. This application requirement section is really fleshing out here as we discuss it.
Seems like the big thing that we forgot or something.
Writes itself.
Yep.
Does anyone think that punting on this
any
is
problems
the
with
wrong
that
answer?
resolution? Yeah.
Okay.
All right, moving on. I think there's one more left here.
Yep.
Harold.
Just if you have a requirement that the application needs to handle a retry, then that turns into a requirement on SFRAME that there be a mechanism for doing the retrying.
Well, it's a simpler requirement though, because you just need to you need to have a clear signal for the thing you're going to retry, right? You need to return an I don't have this key error as opposed to just generic decryption failed.
And then the application would be responsible for holding that packet and putting it back in again when the
Yes.
keys are in. Yeah.
And that must not be detected by SFRAME as a replay. Of course.
Oh, yes. Good point.
That's a very good point.
Must not be treated as a replay. If that is what might happen. Yeah. Right. All right. We have one more issue, I think. Made very good progress.
So I think this is, I think this goes to the other issue we discussed earlier about ratcheting keys and the structure of the key ID.
Yeah, you think you want to do that one together?
Yeah, I think this goes together. The point raised there is, I think, valid. The resolution proposed in the other issue would leak some metadata to the SFU. So a solution, I think this is an additional consideration one could yeah, an additional kind of constraint on solutions to the other issue in terms of trying to hide the metadata while at the same time making it clear to receivers when a new key has been selected. Or else we accept that there is that metadata leak. Sorry for using metadata again. That you leak the information about how many times you've ratcheted the key. Actually, let me just throw that question to the room. Like, does anyone care about that metadata leakage?
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem especially sensitive to me.
So in 99, your structure was essentially bit-packed different components.
Yep.
And if someone follows that construction, although it would be a suggestion only, if someone follows the construction, which is probably quite reasonable, you would learn when each one of those components changes as well as the overall thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is anyone concerned? Let me bring up 99. Is anyone concerned about leaking when the sender ID changes, when the key generation changes, or when the ratchet step changes? I think the last one is kind of whatever. And these are all internals of the MLS process, more or less. So
Probably not MLS, because this is a separate section from the MLS integration, although it's a similar construction. The MLS section as we have it now has a similar information leakage in that it reveals explicitly what epoch was used to encrypt, what epoch and which sender within the epoch sent it. So there is that leakage there as well. Right, obviously you could hash all of this stuff and use truncated hashes as the key IDs, assuming that everyone can build the hash tables and know what hash values to expect and how to reverse the hash mapping.
Pseudo-random permutations, yeah. Is it really worthwhile? Yeah.
I probably wouldn't.
Doesn't sound like anyone cares about the permutation. Crickets on.
Yeah, Harald is making it to the mic.
Harold.
Yeah. Harald, I care about the information leakage. And we could just say if the only thing that needs to be in the spec is how many bits you allocate for identifying the key. The rest is up to the application.
Yeah, so I think what I might propose we do here is document the leakage. in the sections where we define these key ID structs, say that whatever things you bit pack into the key ID will be visible and on an end-to-end basis, or visible to SFUs as it transits. And applications, if they're concerned about that leakage, might adopt structures for the key ID that don't reveal that information. So basically, the default approaches we provide in this document would leak some information, but applications would, of course, be clear to choose other ways to pack stuff into key IDs and uniquely identify their keys.
Okay. I know how to build that. That's great.
I
So
might
we have
call on you for some spec text, Martin. Thank you for volunteering.
We'll just get you packet number encryption from Quick, basically. Okay, so that I think, aside from the issues that Yuan has been tasked to look at, which were these very early pieces of feedback during adoption, concludes the substantive issues that we've identified. I think based on the discussion here, why don't I suggest that the editors get together, work through these. I think that we have pretty clear direction on most of them. I think the replay one may need a little bit of discussion on the list in the process of working out exactly what you write in the document. But most of these seem like they're pretty clear directions. So set the editors a task of working through these one by one, coming up with proposals, consulting with the list if you think that needs to happen, pulling out the information from these reviews from Bernard and Eka, and then hopefully a new revision. If nothing comes up during this process that requires extensive discussion, I think we'll probably go straight to working group last call for the document that comes out as a resolution to this one. Assuming, of course, everything goes smoothly as it did today, which seems likely. So
yeah, just to put a deadline out there, I might propose that we put something on the calendar for about a month out, in case there's any issues that come out. We can always cancel if we don't need it, but that will give us at least a target to drive some action toward.
Yeah, so what I might do is I'll organize an hour virtual interim, and put out a poll for times and whatnot in about a month's time, when I'm not on when I come back from my vacation. But we will then have that discussion ready to go, but we'll probably just plan to cancel it in anticipation of the editors giving us a draft that's good before that time. Any thoughts on that plan, Jonathan?
You mentioned going to working group last call, and like I think I said, I'd be somewhat more comfortable if we had, at least, reasonably progressed application definitions before, I guess before PubRec, which I guess, we do a working group last call and then we didn't really mean it because we actually were going to do another review. But I feel like I'd like to see, the at least reasonable maturity of applications. And I don't know if that's this working group or somewhere else, which is another interesting question. But it's basically, know whether we got all the application requirements right, and actually, using them.
Okay, thank you. Bernard.
Yeah, I think there's something that has to be said because there's an elephant in the room, which is that the RTP document, it's been promised to ABT Core that there'd be a document. We've been waiting for 2 years, and there were major objections to the document 2 years ago. So there's a very good possibility this whole thing could be dead on arrival unless there's some movement on that. So you really can't, you got to have something. Because It looks, there's a very good case to be made that you've been venue shopping here. Basically, something was brought to ABT Core that was rejected, and you're trying to get it to do a working group last call on it. That's just not going to fly.
Let me present a slightly sunnier view on that. I think we do have applications shipping using basically this, the draft version of S-Frame. So there is some degree of maturity in applications. What those applications haven't broached are the kind of more systemic implications if you try to do this kind of properly integrated into the RTP and SDP framework. So I agree that there's some risk.
It's the thing that the basic problem is what you're putting into is that S-Frame is about encrypting frames, and right, and S-Packet really is about something quite different. It's about encrypting RTP payloads, and those are two different things. So you have to be clear about which one of those two you're doing, and that's what the RTP draft is. Basically, as I understand it, it would not be talking about encrypting frames, but encrypting RTP payloads. Whereas encrypting frames is fine for other stuff like web transport or mock or whatever. So anyway, that's the thing that's still up in the air, and it really needs to be tied down.
Yeah, I agree that needs to get tied down at some point. I think I'm less worried about this in the sense that the kind of procedural consensus finding maneuver that was done here was to say, yes, S-Frame and S-Packet are different things, but the encryption framing they do can be the same, right? The actual crypto operations. And so the document we're trying to tackle here is just those bits. And yes, it's probably a little inapt to call it S-Frame. In fact, I think there may have been a renaming issue somewhere that we didn't take action on.
Yeah, S-Frame is fine though. It's just that's where putting the RTP stuff actually holds you back. If you take that out, everything is pretty clean. But somewhere you have to define what goes into it, and that's the part that you really really needs to be worked on.
Yeah. No, there will be more work to do once we get this format defined. Maybe probably more in ABT Core than in this working group done.
So I want to understand this a little better from perspective. So I'm hearing from Richard that he's saying that this is an encryption format, and we can get that laid down and then build the RTP on top of it with some reasonable expectation that's going to be successful. I'm hearing that Bernard's a little concerned that there will be something that happens in that process of defining the RTP pieces that will invalidate some of the assumptions we made here. Is that
no? I think what Richard says is perfectly fine, but the problem is you've mixed in all this RTP stuff, which kind of muddies the water, and some of the diagrams make it seem like the difference between S-Packet and S-Frame is just packetization. It's not. It's more. It's what actually gets encrypted. So anyway, it's just another argument for cleaning up that issue about the RTP stuff. I think that most of it just isn't needed. You don't, right? For what you're trying to do, if it's just about the encryption format, you don't care.
Yeah, I agree. I think we could probably streamline out some of that stuff.
Okay. Well, I think what we'll do in particular is ensure that, Bernard, you have a look at those pieces of the document as they're cleaned up, and we make sure that we don't confuse things too much. And if you have objections, then we want to hear about them. So let's
I just think the one thing you should think about is there anything that changes in the S-Frame format depending on what's being encrypted inside of it? Right? Do you need to know whether it's a frame or an RTP payload that's being encrypted?
Yeah.
And here's just a weird thing to throw you for a loop, right? In RTP over QUIC, the frame and the payload of this payload has infinite MTU. Right. So what exactly is in that payload? Is it, in the case that it's inside of QUIC, is it a large RTP payload, like the whole frame in an RTP payload format, or is it the frame in the raw frame format? I think you need to know when you encrypt it and use it, which one it is.
Yeah, I think my assertion would be that the sender and the receiver need to agree, but I don't think the encryption layer needs to know.
Right. It doesn't need to know, but the thing that gets it needs to know.
Right.
And it's not clear to me how that's indicated. Like, is there anything on the S-frame that tells you? I don't think so.
No. We can potentially do key diversity or something like that if it matters. Jonathan.
And it is potentially an interesting question. It is an interesting question whether the SFU needs to know, or whether this could be agreed between the sender and receiver without the SFU knowing or caring. But that's, I don't know if that would work or not. But it's an interesting question.
I don't think the SFU needs to care.
Probably, but there might be subtleties. I'm worried there's subtleties. I mean, like, you know, it might depend on, you know, I don't know. I mean, in
Okay,
particular,
so-
things like whether, in particular, I think, well, things like whether the thing over which your auth tag is computed is in one packet or multiple packets, the SFU needs to know, don't, you know, partially drop things that have a single authentication tag and things like that. I mean, you could, but it would be not useful anyway.
Excellent topics for the AVT core discussion, I think.
All right, I think we're getting close. Is there any other business?
I guess my question would be, if anybody does want to define this for something other than RTP, what would be the venue for that? I mean, maybe nobody wants to do that work, and so it's a moot question. But I think, you know, I think there is probably at least abstractly interested in using this for mock, for instance, and maybe that would mean do it in mock. But
Yeah, that may be maybe something that becomes moot if we manage to correctly write down what the application needs to do. And so mock can look after that. We're not chartered to do that work. And so leaving it in the domain of those people that are more familiar with the needs of the application, as long as we're very clear about the requirements for the application, is probably the right way to do that.
Okay, but I mean, and I guess, you know, I don't think, you know, you want to use this for HLS or something, but you know, I don't know if there.
Yeah, I don't know who owns HLS, but again, it would be more appropriate for someone who owns HLS to do that work.
Okay, probably agree.
I think Apple owns HLS.
Right.
So it's on to UN, is what you're saying?
But you know, and MPEG might do it for Dash, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think yeah, as Martin says, the task for this group is to nail that punch list that the application needs to fill out, and then the application owners can do the rest.
Yeah.
With the caveat that hopefully at least some of the draft authors realize that for RTP, they might not do it in this working group, but they're still on the hook to do it.
Right.
Speaking as an APT core chair.
Okay. So lots of work for AVT core, apparently, if that document ever gets there again.
Yes, well, lots of work for draft authors, not chairs.
Indeed. And certainly not the chairs.
Yes.
All right,
I
then.
would encourage the draft authors of this to be the draft authors of that, but you know,
Likewise.
unless you can find another Stucky, but probably it's the people with the same knowledge is a good idea.
That's good. All right. Unless there's any other business, I think we might conclude and give people back 5 minutes of their horrible hours of the evening. Thanks, Richard, for going through all those issues and working through them with us. Okay. Thanks all. Concluded. Let's just see. Da-da-da-da. Done. How do I end this meeting? Okay.
I think Medico just does it for you, but I'm not sure.
But we're done. Oh well.
Yeah,
Too bad.
Hey,
No,
I'll figure
thank you, everyone.
yeah, thank you.
About your extra document. His only gripe is that Shepherd right out the metadata and the document don't confirm what status. How would like this one? Take a look at these wonderful graphs. It doesn't matter what it is. Take a look at the, like, none of them are the same thickness, but the thickness doesn't mean anything. It's just... Yeah. So, sort of get the conclusion that this working group was probably a mistake. But we're basically... Yeah.
If we can get away with describing the documents in such a narrow scope that we have about 6 months of the application that uses this needs to think about.
Yeah, I think that as we went through each one of those application requirements, they were each individually quite reasonable for an application to consider and handle. It's a long list.
Well, you know what? It's one of the reasons why we're interested in S-frame again.
Hmm.
We have this S-frame.